Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Davenant Academy and our class, Introduction to the Reformation. In this second video, we'll be looking more at why the Reformation was necessary. In the last video, we looked at the doctrine of salvation in the late medieval church and how it was increasingly seen as a kind of ladder that you climbed to heaven and you would get there sort of step by step, and you were never sure if you were going to make it all the way or if you might fall through. If you did fall through, you might be able to do the sacrament of penance and be put back on the ladder. When you received the Eucharist and other means of grace, you moved further up. But there was no guarantee that you would die in a state of grace. And in any case, probably, even if you died in a state of grace, you didn't die in enough grace that you were going straight to heaven. You would have to go through a period of time in purgatory after death. Now, in this lesson, I want to look more about the relationship between different groups within the church and how these accentuated some of the tensions and conflicts that were ready at the time of the Reformation, ready to burst forth in response to Luther's protest. So really, if you think about the way that medieval society was structured, there wasn't just one ladder to heaven. There were three different ladders, and they were at different levels of steepness. You had the ordinary lay people, ordinary Christians, on a ladder that went like this, that was not too steep, relatively easy to climb, not too demanding, but didn't get you that high up. So probably you're going to have a fair bit of purgatory left after death to get you the rest of the way up. Then above that, you had the clergy ladder, steeper, harder, got you a little further. And the clergy were the priests, the ordained people. And they were seen as constituting a different class within the church. And then finally, there were the monks. It was the monastic ladder. This was the highest and steepest path to heaven. This was the path of greatest holiness, but also most difficult path. Now, the clergy, all right, why was their path harder? Why was it steeper? Well, in theory, they had things were more difficult for them than for ordinary believers. For one thing, they were not allowed to marry, and they had to devote their lives to the service of the church. In return, however, they received various benefits that ordinary believers did not enjoy. One of these, for instance, was called the benefit of the clergy. And this was the idea that the clergy were not liable to be tried by civil courts. The clergy were exempt from prosecution. If they committed a crime, they would go before their bishop. They would go before an ecclesiastical court, which would be responsible for punishing them. Now, this might have been all right if those ecclesiastical courts administered justice fairly and impartially, just like the civil courts. In practice, many times the ecclesiastical courts would let the priests off rather easier than ordinary people would get for the same crime. Right? And this was perhaps in theory because the church wanted to temper justice with mercy. The gospel, applauds the virtue of mercy, and so therefore ecclesiastical courts tried to be more merciful. But often it was more like the priests were simply protecting their own, and so the priests could get by with a lot more than ordinary people could. The priests could commit crimes and not be held to account. This was at least the concern in many times and places, and sometimes it was a very fair concern. Even in the modern church, Roman Catholic Church, this has been a concern, for instance, with the widespread sex abuse scandals. Although Protestant churches have their own version of this. We often try to protect the clergy instead of holding them to account. So this benefit of the clergy was one source of conflict. But the clergy, in theory, were supposed to be holier than the laity. They were closer to God. They were, in fact, the church. The term church, was often used to describe the clergy, not to describe the whole body of believers. Right? When they spoke of the church, they meant the church as an institution, as a set of authorities. The clergy would take communion frequently, sometimes daily, whereas the laity would only receive once a year. And when the laity received, they would receive only the bread, whereas the clergy received both the bread and the wine. Now, what about the monks? What about the monastic ladder? Here is a picture of an Augustinian monk. As you see, monks were known for shaving the tops of their heads, but they were also known for three key vows that they took. The vow of chastity, swearing off marriage or any sexual relations. The vow of poverty, okay, giving up all of their worldly goods, all of their private property. And the vow of obedience, giving up their own will and being subject to the will of their abbot, their superior. Now, becoming a monk was a way of being more devoted to God, spending your life in prayer and worship and service and sometimes teaching. And many monks did a great job of this. However, the problem was, if you think about it, that you were only really, the vow of poverty was only really meaningful if you were leaving a place of relative wealth and going to a place of relative poverty. Many people were giving up poverty, private poverty, joining monasteries that were actually fairly comfortable, well-off places. And so becoming a monk could actually be a ticket to a life of greater comfort and luxury. This became the case more and more as the Middle Ages went on. Here's a picture of Fontevraud Abbey in France, a very large monastery that, as you can imagine, from a building of complex this size, had quite a bit of wealth, quite a bit of land. Now, why would they have so much wealth and land? Well, because if you think again about the system of kind of grades of holiness, imagine you're a wealthy nobleman who has fought a few wars that you regret, maybe killed a couple of peasants, maybe carried on a couple of affairs. You're nearing death. You know you have a lot of sin that hasn't been dealt with, and you want to shorten your time in purgatory. Well, in your will, you might give a large chunk of land to a monastery to provide wealth to pay for the monks to pray for your soul after death. And in fact, all around Europe, there were these things called chantry chapels. Many cathedrals had loads of chantry chapels, and that's where there would be a monk who was paid for. His job was every day to go and chant, to pray for the soul of the donor, the benefactor. So by this means, the monasteries gained more and more wealth as they were constantly being given wealth and land by noblemen. Here, for instance, this is after the Reformation, but this is Melk Abbey in Austria. This is the building that was built around 1700, which shows you how astonishingly wealthy many of these monasteries had become. Now, of course, there were many attempts to deal with this, to reform this system, and to establish purer monasteries, simpler monasteries that were really dedicated to the monastic ideal. But this would backfire, right? Because you would establish a more serious, more holy monastery, and it would get a reputation for holiness. And so, if you're a wealthy nobleman leaving your land to some monastery, you're going to leave it to the holiest monastery, the purest, truest monastery. And so, those monastic orders would also become wealthier and tend to become more corrupt. But there were many serious, well-intentioned monks, and Luther's order, the Augustine hermits, was one of those. This was made up of monks that genuinely did live in poverty and that were dedicated to a life of teaching. However, as I said, in many cases, being a clergyman or being a monk was supposed to be a harder life, a steeper climb, but in reality, it didn't seem more difficult. It seemed easier in many cases. And yet they had a higher level of holiness. They had an easier route. They were more likely to get into heaven. So this caused a lot of tension and conflict in the church. Now, this conflict was particularly intense at the level of the highest authorities, the Pope and the Emperor. So, what is this chart that we are looking at here? Forgive me for saying model 4. This is from a larger set of slides. We're going to look at 4 different models here, and this is the first of those 4, so ignore the number. So this is what's called the two swords model. The two swords idea, which is articulated by Pope Gelasius in the 400s, tried to parse out the differences between civil authority and spiritual authority, between Pope and King, or Pope and Emperor, by saying that God has given two swords. There is the spiritual sword by which the soul is governed. There is the material or temporal sword by which the body is governed. And he delegates power. The solid line represents a delegation of power. The dotted line represents an exercise of power. And blue represents civil or temporal power, and red represents spiritual power. So he delegates temporal authority to the king. The king exercises that temporal authority over the Christian people. He delegates spiritual authority to the priest, who exercises that spiritual authority over the Christian people. The king can punish bodies, the priest can punish souls. The king can lock people up in prison. The priest can lock people up with the keys, which have the keys of the kingdom, in which he can say, your sins have not been forgiven yet. Now, crucially, they could each do this to each other as well. In this model, a priest who committed a crime could be, if he murdered someone, he could be hung. A king who committed a serious sin that he didn't repent of, the priest could have him excommunicated and cast out of the church. Now, many civil rulers began to feel that this power of excommunication, the red line going this way, was being abused, and it was too much power, because the Pope, for instance, could say to the emperor, you are excommunicated, and therefore your subjects no longer have to obey you. Okay, so he could basically overthrow a king, potentially, that he disagreed with by using this spiritual authority. So the imperial view was initially this model, that we can call moderate imperialism. And in this, it looks similar, except notice here, the king has a power over the priests, a bodily power, power of the temporal sword, that the priest does not have over the king. Okay, it goes one way. Now, in response to that, many popes began to say, no, it's the other way around. The priest, and particularly the pope, has an authority over civil authorities and even the emperor that does not go the other way. Okay, the priest can excommunicate the king, but the king cannot do anything to the priest. And this is, of course, where we get the idea of the benefit of the clergy, the idea that the clergy are exempt from civil authority. There's no blue line going this direction. All right, so this becomes a source of increasing tension and conflict politically within Europe, because the Pope, as he becomes more powerful, has political interests as well. He does not merely have the spiritual interests of the church at heart, and yet he's able to wield these very powerful spiritual weapons of excommunication. So, for instance, famously in the year 1077, this is showing Henry IV repenting before Gregory VII at Canossa in 77. So this is a very, very important event in the lead up to the Reformation, was hundreds of years beforehand. So Henry IV is the Holy Roman Emperor. He's the most powerful ruler in Europe, and yet he gets in a dispute with Pope Gregory VII. Pope Gregory has him excommunicated and says that that someone else should replace him. That he tells the subjects they don't have to obey him; they should pick another king. Henry begins to lose support among his people because the Pope doesn't merely excommunicate him; he also puts the people under an interdict. An interdict was when the Pope could refuse the sacraments to everyone within a particular area, not just the king. And so, in theory, that means that you might die without receiving the last rites. People may be going to hell because of the sin of their ruler. So Henry loses a lot of support, and he has to go barefoot in the snow, as this picture shows, to the Pope's palace at Canossa, begging the Pope for forgiveness and absolution. Now, as it turns out, the Pope absolves him. Henry goes back and raises an army and attacks Rome. So in this case, the temporal sword actually beat the spiritual sword. But over time, the popes claiming this authority of the spiritual sword over rulers, they were able to gain more and more political leverage. All right, so let's see here. Let me go back to this. So let me show you a couple more examples of this. In fact, from English history, familiar names that may be familiar to you from English history are tied up in these whole conflicts between Pope and Emperor. So, for instance, the martyr, Thomas à Becket, shown here, being martyred by 3 knights of Henry II. He's remembered as a martyr in the English Church. The Roman Catholic Church wants him to be considered a martyr. But why was he killed? Well, his dispute with Henry II was actually over this issue of the benefit of the clergy. The idea that the clergy should be immune from certain kinds of civil prosecution. And Henry II did not think that was fair or appropriate. He thought as king, he should have equal legal authority over the clergy. So Thomas à Becket really dies for the claim, not for Christian faith per se, but for the claim that the church is exempt from civil authority. Also, of course, you may know about the Magna Carta. This is King John doing homage to the emissary of Pope Innocent III. The Magna Carta, King John having to sign away various royal powers, actually, the background to that was that he had gotten into a dispute with the Pope, and the Pope had placed over the appointment of church officials, and the Pope had placed all of England under an interdict, right? This thing where he withholds the sacraments. So that caused John to lose a lot of his support, a lot of the barons to rise up against him, and that's part of the background to the Magna Carta. It's not so much a conflict between the king and the people as it is between the king and the Pope. Now, the strongest statement of papal power comes with a guy named Pope Boniface VIII in the year 1302, and he articulates, let me write that down here for you, Pope Boniface VIII, he issues a bull, a decree called Unum Sanctum in 1302, and that articulates this hierocratic model, as we could call it. And notice here, there are still two colors, blue and red, but they both go to the priestly power first, the Pope. And then the Pope delegates, remember the blue solid line represents delegation. So God delegates civil authority and spiritual authority to the Pope. And then the Pope delegates civil authority to the king while continuing to exercise spiritual authority over him and over the people. So in this, not only is, and we'll go back here for comparison, okay? Not only is the priestly power above the kingly power in the sense that it's exempt from it, it's not under its control, but it actually, kingly power derives from the Pope. All power flows from God to the Pope and then downward. So the Pope says, in theory, he's like, you're just doing a job for me. He says it to the King of France. You're just doing a job for me. I can get rid of you if I want. Okay, all authority on heaven and earth belongs to the popes in this understanding. And in fact, the bull Unum Sanctum says, furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. So this is, where I'm having trouble getting back to my, there we go. This is Pope Boniface VIII here. So that he says that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that everyone be subject to the Roman pontiff. So these are the kind of really outlandish claims that are increasingly being made by the popes in the later Middle Ages, and they're going to set the stage for the Protestant Reformation. Now, Boniface didn't actually work out very well for him. Once again, the material sword proved more powerful. The King of France sent an army to Rome, beat up on the Pope, and in fact, popes after that were for a long period in Avignon, in France, where they were kind of under the influence of the French kings. But these claims were not forgotten. These claims that the Pope actually had authority over all human powers. So, on the eve of the Reformation, there are many civil authorities that are very nervous about the kinds of claims of authority the Pope is making and the way that he can destabilize them. And he can undermine their kingdoms and their attempts to administer justice by trying to use his spiritual powers. So the popes on the eve of the Middle Ages are very wealthy. This is showing the papal palace at the time of the Renaissance here. Okay, the popes were spending all these wonderful artworks in the Renaissance that are so famous. The Sistine Chapel, for instance. Someone had to pay for all that stuff. The popes were paying for it. And the popes were paying for it with all this wealth that they were extracting from all over Europe. And one of the main ways of paying for it was, of course, indulgences. Remember those sort of get out of purgatory cards that we talked about last time. So, at the eve of the Reformation, there's a lot of tension between the ordinary Christians who feel like they are, in a way, they're being sucked dry to pay for the luxury of the church authorities, and supposedly the church authorities get to heaven ahead of them. The church authorities have a higher ladder, they get more grace, and they get to live a more posh life, so it seems. And they get to tell the kings how to do their job. All of these things are the source of great bitterness and frustration at the time of the Reformation. And so it's no surprise that when Luther begins protesting against indulgences and against papal corruption, that it is a spark that quickly ignites a widespread Reformation. And before we get to that story, though, we're going to go and talk about some of the reformers before Luther, some of the reformers who did attempt reform and who were not successful, but laid some of the groundwork for what he was able to do in 1517. So join us for lesson 3.